Hello and welcome. My name is Barbara Scott, and I am the Executive Director of the Parents League of New York. And I am thrilled to be here this afternoon with some folks from the Tutoring League of New York. Um, Parents League, as you may or may not know, is an organization that was founded over 100 years ago. And as such, our mission then, as it is today, is to help parents to think about their parenting and to think about schools and school settings for their children. And whether you have a child and you're looking for an early childhood setting, or you are looking for a new middle or high school setting, Parents League is here with you for that. And we offer all sorts of conversations, and that's what brings us here today, not just around schooling, but around the health and wellness of children and around social emotional growth, clearly around academic learning and all that goes with it. I am going to share a little bit about our format today. We are joined here, as I said, by some experts from the Tutoring League who will take an opportunity in just a minute to introduce themselves individually. But I did want to share that this will be a conversation with my colleagues, and that conversation will last about 40 minutes. We do ask that there will be a question and answer period toward the end of the conversation, and we do ask that if you have a specific question, that you enter that question in the chat. So using the chat function. In the meantime, if you would like to put on your camera, parents, we are happy to have your camera on. If you're at the office and that's not convenient for you, we understand, but it always makes for a warmer, more connected conversation if cameras are on. So do what's best for you. So I'm going to jump right into it and ask our panelists to introduce themselves. So I'm just going to go in alphabetical order. Dana, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and say a little bit about you?
Sure. Thank you so much, Barbara. Hi, I'm Dana. I taught upper school math and economics at Trinity for 10 years and tutored privately throughout that time. I left the classroom in June 2022, and I've been tutoring full time ever since. And as my name suggests, I really focus on high school math. I do a little bit of middle school as well.
John.
Hi. Thank you, Barbara. Yeah, very nice to be here. Yeah, so as far as my professional background, I've been a full-time tutor for over a decade now, and most of what I've done is with standardized tests. So I have a lot of experience with the ACT, SAT, IC, SSAT, the Shazat. So that where most of my tutoring is. I also provide some academic help, but just in terms of what I generally offer, it's test prep.
How about Beck?
Hey, thanks, Barbara, and thanks for having us today. My name is Beck Goodman, and I'm a full-time private tutor for about 4 years now, and I specialize in early childhood education with a focus in early literacy up through the age of 7.
Thank you. And Kate?
Hi, thank you, Barbara. Hi, everyone. My name is Kate Sullivan. I was at the Windward School for 10 years, and I taught in a few other schools as well. I am currently working as a private learning specialist full-time. So I work primarily with elementary age students and specifically with students who need remediation in the special education field. So a lot of students with learning disabilities, dyslexia, writing, and speech.
And last but not least, Jane. And Jane, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Tutoring League as an entity?
Sure. So I'll tell you really quickly, I'm Jane Moskowitz. I was born and raised in New York City. I went to Dalton, and I was a teacher at Stephen Gaynor School, a special ed school on the Upper West Side for a number of years. And I left in 2020 and have been working with students one-on-one ever since then. My primary focus, my bread and butter, is everything literacy related students, K through 12, anything from decoding to more analytical writing. almost a year ago, I started the Tutoring League of New York City, which is a community for education practitioners here in New York. At first, I started it with the hopes of convening full-time tutors like myself. And many of our 60 plus members are full-time tutors here in New York City. But what has happened is our membership really runs the gamut, and we have education practitioners, part of the league, from every corner of education. So Tutoring League is home to 60 plus members who are neuropsychologists, occupational therapists, full-time tutors, learning specialists, you name it, we have it. And really at our core, we are a community of practitioners. We come together for support, for professional learning, for networking. And we are so excited to be here today to share some of our experience with all of you about tutoring.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jane.
Sure.
So we'll get started. So tutoring, how do you know when it's time for your child to seek the support of a tutor? Kate, how does a parent know when it's time?
I would say the right time to start thinking about a tutor is when there is something, some piece of your child's education that's missing, whether that be something that the school has said to you that their child is either behind in a certain area and the school is noticing that, or even that they are ahead, they're more gifted than some of their fellow classmates and they need more enrichment. If the school hasn't said anything, we have many families who have said to us that the parents just kind of had a gut feeling that something wasn't right, especially for students who might fall in the learning disability range. They could see that their child was slow to rhyme or didn't pick up books as readily as their siblings or their classmates. Also, parents a lot of times might be sitting with their children while they're doing their homework and notice that they are really struggling with homework, whether it be the content or, getting their actual ideas down on the paper, or even being able to read the words that are on the page or complete the math problems. The last thing that probably would come from a school recommendation would be if a family has gone through with a neuropsychological evaluation and the neuropsych has recommended that the family pursue additional help outside the classroom in the form of a learning specialist or a tutor to either, again, enhance or remediate where the child is.
Fantastic. Dana, how does a parent know that a tutor is the right fit for their child? Personality match is important in any relationship, but this is a particular kind of relationship. So tell us about finding the best fit tutor for your child and family.
Totally. And it can be a little bit tricky. So I think the most important thing is to just be realistic about where your child is at, their needs, and everyone's goals, and then try to find someone very narrowly tailored in their experience in working towards that specific end. And the more specific your child's needs, the more important it is to really get an expert in that field. So some examples of that would include a diagnosed learning difference, or if the curriculum at your child's school is very nuanced and requires a certain pedagogical background. And in general, the older a student is, the more nuanced their needs. Like, you may be able to find an all-purpose science tutor to tutor intro biochem and physics, but then by the time your child is in AP, that might not be the best fit anymore. And totally, Barbara, as you mentioned, personality fit is valid and very important. You want the tutor to motivate the child to be the best possible version of themselves. And if that connection and trust isn't there, the student won't get the maximum benefit from the partnership. So if you're looking for curricular support, my number one recommendation for finding a quality tutor would actually be to reach out to faculty at your child's school and ask for recommendations. Contrary to what some parents think, this is not at all taboo, especially if a student is really struggling. And I feel this is particularly true for subjects like math and science, where there really is no concern about breaches of academic integrity or anything like that, because most of the assessments take place in person at school. And I only do math, but I know a bunch of other tutors, and there's a lot of great tutors in Tutoring League who are fabulous. So if anyone needs a recommendation, or they're looking for someone who, can fill a different need, I'm always happy to pass along referrals. And I'm sure the same is true for tutors you've worked well with in the past.
Terrific. I'm going to jump around here a little bit and say, how often should a student work with a tutor? Is there a set amount of time for individual sessions, or is there a recommendation or set of thinking thoughts around the number or frequency of tutoring? Often, like anything, you can go to the gym once a week, right? Or you can go to the gym twice or three times a week and get, varying results. So does it work the same way with tutoring? I think I'm going to throw that question out to Dana and Jon.
Sure. Dana, do you want to go first?
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is something we've discussed before in our group, and the answer to this question would vary so much even between all of us. So I'm sure Jon has, certain like test prep specific recommendations, and for younger students, the recommendation might be totally different. But for high school curricular subject on a specific subject, actually meeting once a week for an hour, maybe with a second session added in during a test week, really tends to be the sweet spot. And to be honest, if it seems like the student needs more than that, to me, that's usually a sign that something isn't working. So either the class they're enrolled in at school isn't quite the right level for them, or they're not doing enough independent work between sessions, because the tutor should definitely set the student up with many tasks to do on their own, with their teacher, with friends, between the times they meet. But it is nice to have the regularity of a once a week check-in on content, so that if and when questions arise throughout the week, students have a dedicated time to get them answered. And there are some students who I meet with only in advance of tests, and this can be helpful for kids who really just want someone to answer specific questions and bounce some ideas off of, like literally the night before test, but significant progress won't be made in that sort of time frame and consistency.
Barbara, do you mind if I just jump in really quickly?
Please do.
So just to add a little bit more to that. So Dana, you typically work with high school students who, and correct me if I'm wrong, who are excelling in class. Is that usually the case?
Yeah.
Or
So and again, I only do math. I think like a lot of, you guys do a bunch of subjects. So I think that like makes it totally different in and of itself. But even for a student who's struggling in math, like meeting for more than 60 minutes a week, it's like, okay, you have what, 180 hours of class, 180 minutes of class a week. Like if you need much more than 60 minutes of one-on-one time, I do think something is off for like that particular content. But I know that differs by like age and number of subjects and all of that.
Right. So what I would say is, whereas like Kate and I usually work with students who are a little bit younger, who maybe already have a diagnosed learning difference, or there's sort of a question mark around what's something going on. For younger students, particularly, I find that it's really difficult to meaningfully make progress and move the needle without a minimum of 2 45-minute sessions a week. And I just want to explain why. One is, I think it is absolutely essential, and we might get to this later, with another question. It is so essential for tutors to be consistent and to also have a finger on the pulse of what is going on in the classroom and in this child's life. The tutor should be a really sort of cohesive presence in a child's life, and sometimes sort of in a family. And then the second thing that I just want to explain too is what we're saying when we're saying tutoring, which it all looks different for all of us, but this is really not sitting next to a kid and doing homework, right? This is not homework help when we say tutoring. This is highly individualized, nuanced academic support, sometimes enrichment, sometimes test prep, by a professional who has an academic background, an advanced degree in education. And what is so beautiful about that one-on-one time is so often students are struggling, not necessarily because they have a learning difference, because their learning style does not match with the way they're being taught in school. I have a highly visual learner who's being taught by someone who's using a lot of verbal pedagogy and methodology. It's not necessarily that they don't understand the content, but they need that extra time with me one-on-one so I can present it in a way that works for their brain. So there's a lot of caveats here with frequency. But I think, 2 times a week and more usually does work for younger students who maybe their learning style is not aligning with the way they're being taught in class. Certainly, if there's a learning difference, at least 2 times a week. For an older student who's basically doing well in class and needs a little more support, I think once a week, 60 minutes a week definitely can suffice. But I'll turn it over to Jon, who can speak from the test prep lens.
Sure. So as far as the test prep lens, when I think about this question, I definitely think about it in terms of the school year and the summer, because during the school year, obviously students tend to be much busier, unless they have a very vigorous full-time job or, going to, sleepaway camp, something like that over the summer. So when it comes to the school year for middle schoolers and high schoolers, I tend to recommend meeting twice a week. And as far as why that is that for one thing, when the tutoring, when this test prep process is more concentrated, students retain more and they retain more quickly. So by meeting twice a week, you actually potentially shorten the number of months that the student needs the tutoring. And then also by meeting twice a week, it gives the students fewer opportunities to sort of ingrain mistakes. Because, if you have one lesson a week and then you give them a week's worth of homework, then that, especially early on in the tutoring process, can sort of open itself up to the possibility of ingraining the opposite of what you want to ingrain. So that's, for middle schoolers, high schoolers, maybe people who, are applying for, like a 5th grade test for the IC, SSAT, something like that. And, when I talk about meeting twice a week, it's also keeping in mind that whether it's the ACT, SAT, IC, SSAT, the Shazat, at all age levels, except for maybe like kind of youngish elementary schoolers, there's a lot of material on these tests. So meeting twice a week is also just a matter of just thinking about like just the mountain, like the large quantity of material that you need to cover. And that being said, meeting once a week can still be helpful for test prep. It's just not optimal. So that's for during the school year. During the summer, if a student has the time, I actually recommend meeting 3 times a week, because I'm very much of the mindset that you want to get the test prep process done as soon as possible while still getting an excellent score. And the summer is a real opportunity to just make a lot of progress on that front. So something to keep in mind also.
Nice.
So I think what I'm hearing is that for younger kids, elementary school age, that twice a week, slightly shorter sessions, maybe 45 minutes or so, and that frequency and developing a relationship is really important. That for older, let's call them middle and high school kids, that once a week, subject specific, typically can be enough and productive and helpful. And maybe an extra check-in or two if there's a big unit test coming or that kind of thing. And then on the test prep front, I'm hearing, really concentrated, get in there and, run the mile, run the 2 mile, run the 3 mile, with the test prep, get it done, get it solid in a consolidated period. So across the ages, depending on the ages and stages of your child, it sounds like there are different approaches in terms of times and
Barbara, one context we didn't touch was enrichment. So we talked about, right, the student who's studying for a test, who's doing basically okay in high school, maybe students who Kate and I work with who might have a learning difference. I wonder if Beck could just add her 2 cents about frequency of sessions when we're really focusing on enrichment for early childhood.
Sure.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. I think that for early childhood, meaning between ages 3 and 7, it should be really viewed as an enrichment like any other enrichment class that they're taking, like a gymnastics or a cooking or a music. It is just a really fun time to engage with something that is energizing for them and allows them to think about the world in a new way and explore new material. And so for enrichment purposes, especially for the little ones, I think one time a week keeps it fun, it keeps it exciting, it keeps it special, and it keeps it meaningful.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask about communication between the tutor or between home and school around tutoring. Jane, do you want to weigh in there?
Yeah.
How should this relationship go? I think parents are often, unsure about letting the school know that they're getting support. So can you speak to that a bit?
Of course. And there's a lot of caveats, a lot of subcategories. So I'm sure my colleagues will want to chime in. For me personally, I am a very, very big believer in communication. I think when I take on a student, I see myself as becoming part of that student's educational team. And communication with the school helps me be more effective. I need to be in communication with teachers to understand what's going on in class, what's coming down the pike, so that I can develop sessions that maybe preview content, maybe review content with which the student struggled. I want to hear where students are finding success so I can lean on those strengths in sessions, and what is still challenging for students. It's really hard to do that without a direct line of communication into schools. You touched on something that can be sensitive. Students maybe not wanting their teachers to know that they have a tutor. And that is valid. I think it's a larger conversation for tutors to have with families and with students, because like I said, when there is communication, that really just amplifies the success, the efficacy of a tutor. Certainly, I think for the younger grades, elementary, even middle, high school, there's a lot of information posted on Google Classroom and various other sort of Blackboard and all these other mediums. So you could probably get away with not being as communicative, but still more information is always better. So huge believer in communication between tutor and school to the extent that schools are willing.
I think often in the enrichment realm, and maybe Beck wants to speak to this, parents are a little secretive with each other. So not only are they not telling the school, but maybe at drop off or pickup, they're not really telling anybody that, they're whisking, little Sally or little Johnny away, to spend some time with a special friend. So tell us a little bit about, how to handle if your child is getting some enrichment or some remediation, right? Because they've got a speech and language, delay or something that they're working through developmentally.
Definitely. So I think in terms of how the parent frames that time, it really depends on who the parent is speaking to. When they speak to their child, I think, I'm a really big advocate for being honest. When a child comes to me and tells me that they're going to hang out with mom's friend, and all of a sudden mom's friend has a bunch of letters and a dry erase board and is with them one-on-one, it is not really engaging them in the actual process because they don't really know what's happening. And so I think when you're speaking with your child, it's very important to have them participate in the goal setting to make meaning of the time, to tell them that I'm a teacher. I'm a teacher that works with kids one-on-one, which a lot of them experience now in small pull-out reading groups or in other pull-out times during the day. And we're going to do blocks and drawing and this and that, and it's going to be fun. And it's going to be fine. I think when parents frame this conversation to other parents, it's, a big part is about their comfort level, especially if their child is receiving some additional support services like speech or OT or something like that. That's, totally up to their discretion. I think when there's this kind of hidden talk, this secrecy around enrichment work, particularly surrounding the kindergarten admissions process, which I also do quite a bit of support in, I think that that kind of builds this sense of true competition between very small children. And ultimately, as adults, we should be modeling wanting all children to have the most access to education. There is, I think, no need for secrecy. It is an opportunity to work one-on-one with a loved adult towards learning, like they're doing in all different settings throughout the day that don't have that kind of hush, quiet tone about them. And ultimately, it's a parent's choice or a caregiver's choice about if that setting is appropriate for their child. And I think we should just be supportive about how caregivers want to, what they want their children to do after school hours.
Fantastic. Jumping around again, I want to ask, just in the context of this conversation, we hear a lot about executive function. What is executive function? How do tutors support it at the various ages and stages? This is a big buzzword, I have to say. Last year around this time, I think we had a workshop on executive function that had like 300 people in it. So what is it? Why is it important? And how does tutors support it? Jane.
Yeah. So, I mean, what is executive functioning? I feel like that is like the $1,000,000 question. I sort of distill executive functioning down to, which is ignoring a few pieces of it, but I distill it down to, in an educational sense, like your ability to get from point A to point B, your ability to complete a task, to remember important information in completing that task, to organize your thoughts and your physical space. But really at its core, for me, it's like getting from point A to point B, task completion, and all the facets therein. How does a tutor support executive functioning? In 1,000,000 ways. I think any tutor worth their weight should be embedding executive functioning skills in their sessions, and there's so many ways that that's done. First and foremost, modeling, leaning into modeling heavily. So as an time, how do I do task analysis, and how do I create a to-do list? Modeling when we are doing a task together, referencing the directions, going back to the directions consistently. Am I fulfilling the task? Am I fulfilling the criteria? I think also explicitly teaching skills and strategies in the context of schoolwork is the single most helpful way to really teach executive functioning skills. You have a massive paper due. We're going to use that as a medium through which we're going to teach executive functioning. Let's make a schedule. Let's plan ahead. You're going to check in with yourself. Are you getting your tasks done? We're going to chunk this into smaller, more manageable pieces. You're going to get your thesis done on Monday. Then you're going to write your first body paragraph on Tuesday. And by the way, now you set the rest of the plan with me. You be the teacher. You create the chunks of this assignment. So we're explicitly teaching strategies. We're modeling strategies. And also, one of the key ingredients is reflecting on strategies. So if you're using explicit strategies with your student as a tutor, you need to pause at the end of a session or at the beginning of a session and talk about those strategies. How did they work for you? What worked well? What do you want to use next week for this upcoming assignment? This is all executive functioning. And I just want to, beware of hiring someone to just do executive functioning skills, not in the context of a student's work, because I personally question the efficacy of that. I think it needs to be immediately applied to what the student is doing in school in order for them to really internalize those skills. So that's just like a little sneak peek on how I think tutors support executive functioning, but I would turn it over to my colleagues. I'm sure they have more to add there.
Well, I've got a follow-up question, and Kate, maybe you can help us. How can students and families ensure that the learning continues between sessions? We talked a few minutes ago about frequency and that frequency being more or less aligned to ages and stages of child. But how do parents then help the child get to the next 1 week session, or the session, the time in between the 2 45-minute sessions, or help sustain them when they've got to meet the test prep professional 3 times a week in the summer? So can you speak to that a bit, Kate?
Yes, of course. Well, first of all, I love what Jane said about a tutor being part of a child's entire team and sometimes even their family. I know I personally have students that I'm working with now that I've been with for 7, 8 years. So I truly have become, part of their family. And being on a team like that means that everybody needs to be on the same page. So I think a big part of hiring a tutor and finding the right person is making sure that all parties are clear in communication what is expected both during sessions with their students and also in the time in between. Like Dana and Jonathan said, our kids are really busy. They have a lot going on, especially during the school year. So the last thing that we want to do as tutors is add more onto the plates of these families and these kids. But especially in the realm of remediation and trying to get kids to grow, depending on what you're working on with them, there does need to be some sort of follow-up at times. So a great example for me is I work a lot of times with Orton Gillingham, and one way to move the needle on reading skills, spelling skills, writing skills, is for the students to be continuously practicing what we worked on in our sessions. So if we were to read a one-page list with words that contained, the initial blend PL, I would ask the parents to have the students read that list to them maybe 2 more times over the course of the next couple days before I would see the child again. Nothing that's overwhelming or too much on them, something that's very easy for the parents to do. I personally would not ask the parents to ever sit with a child while they did a writing assignment or anything like that. It's much more something I am positive the parents can do with their child that will not add undue stress onto the family schedule or burden onto the parents for feeling like they need to know how to do something that they're not necessarily trained in. Another thing that I'll often say, especially with younger kids, but this applies to older kids too, if there's sight words or vocabulary words or diagrams they have to memorize. Jane and I were just talking about this the other day. I love to have families put the words up in their home in high traffic areas. So as they're walking through, they are constantly looking at that word or constantly looking at that diagram. And of course, for families to be so involved with their kids in terms of what are you reading? Are we reading something together as a family? Let's talk about that. Like making literacy and the love of learning just part of your daily conversations as a family, I think is so huge. And another big part of it is the students knowing that their tutor is an important part of their life, their parents making it so clear that their sessions with their tutor are just as important as their time in school really helps to amplify the respect that the child has for us and that the respect for the work that's being done in our time together.
Terrific. Thank you. So Dana, how does tutoring help confidence? And maybe Beck wants to jump in here on the younger end, but how do you build confidence in the child in the context of a tutoring relationship?
Yeah, sure. So that's actually one of the primary goals of tutoring. And it kind of relates to like this whole conversation of what students should do between sessions and how to organize that. So it's so important for the tutoring session to be seen as only one part of the work a student is doing for a given course each week. So students should definitely still meet with their own teacher, take advantage of the resources available to them at their school, work with friends on their homework, and also do independent work. But the goal of tutoring should be to support the student in engaging more confidently in each of these areas. So they should participate more in class because they feel they have a more solid foundation to stand on. They should feel empowered to work on their homework alone other nights of the week, even if it means that homework isn't 100% perfect, because they generally understand the content and they're comfortable taking risks. A good content tutor will spend a significant amount of time on coaching their students how to think rather than just being like a chat GPT answer bot and showing them step by step what to do. So in fact, if a student is spending more time doing the work for the kid instead of actually supporting the kid and doing the work themselves, that's a sign that it's not a productive fit. And that pairing wouldn't build confidence. But the right combination should definitely make the student feel really good and ready to take on their course the other days of the week.
Anyone want to build on that? Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to hop on for the littles, which ultimately I think is pretty much the same. Confidence is a feeling, and it's a feeling that stays with you from the time you're little to the time you're big. So one of the main goals of my time with students is that some of their first exposures to kind of the early academics are ones that are really positive, because those are the ones that help us frame our relationship with it down the line. A big part of that is your child's personal relationship with their tutor, and making sure it's someone that they're super eager to see. They have a lot to, they want to tell you all about what happened in school and what happened on the walk home. And the other thing that you can see as the caregiver side of that is that when your child starts engaging with the material outside of times that they have to, especially if you're experiencing a younger child who's like demonstrating some resistance and this really doesn't want to read and really doesn't want to do homework, and all of a sudden you're sitting at a restaurant, they look at a menu and they read what they want. They find the word hamburger and they say, I want the hamburger. Let me tell you how I knew it said that. That's a real demonstration for the adults in that child's life that this is making a great impact, because because they feel confident and they feel positive towards the material, they're going to seek out independently opportunities to engage with it. And that will so increase the number of repetitions and opportunities for practice and opportunities for them to be celebrated and for them to show off their knowledge. And it's really just a beautiful thing to see as you watch kids gain that confidence.
So Kate, let me ask, and Jon, you can jump in here as well. How do you measure success, right? How do you measure success? And if you hit a certain level of success, does the relationship continue? We've heard a little bit about, hey, let's get in there and get it done on the test prep side, but what does success look like in a tutoring relationship?
Well, I actually want to jump on what Beck just said, because that is such a perfect segue. When you see a child, whether it be a younger child or an older child, starting to attempt something that was once challenging for them on their own, that is like the greatest measure of success you can possibly see, because at the heart of that is them feeling confident enough in themselves, whether or not they get it right, to attempt it. And that is so huge, because so often kids come to us afraid to attempt anything because they've felt so beaten down by their experience in school thus far. So certainly when you see a kid starting to try to read a street sign, try to read a menu, trying to write their own story or write in their diary, like those are moments where you just say to yourself, wow, it's clicking. They feel so good about themselves and their learning. But more real practical ways to measure success for us is, we're constantly assessing them. Every single time a tutor has a session with a child, they are assessing in the moment what's happening. Afterwards, we're recording data of what happened in that session, and we're planning our next session based on that session. What do we still need to review based on that? What are they still struggling with? When I start my next session, I'm going to spend the first 5 minutes doing this because that was really hard this time. Then I'm going to jump into our new material. So it's a constant review, repetition. Also, like Jean said, we're checking in with the school constantly. So school and the parents are saying to us, well, actually, this week we started this unit and this was really challenging. So do you think you could touch on this with them? And then I usually would follow back up with the school and say, I see this grade on this assignment, like talk not me through, but can you talk our student through, like what can they do better next time? What feedback can you give them on this assignment to ensure that they feel, really the whole point of us working with them is that they can individually do everything we're teaching them how to do by themselves. I want them to be reaching out to the school. I want them to be advocating for themselves. So really when they have that confidence, when we're able to see that, that's the biggest point of success. And in some cases, families can feel really scared to lose that feeling of success, and they want to hold on to tutoring as long as possible because they think that that is the crux of the success. And in so many cases, that is so not the case. And as Jane said earlier, a tutor worth their weight is going to tell you, I think we've done it. I think we're at a point now where we can kind of release your student back into the wild, so to speak, and, let them kind of go forth. And also in some cases, there are children we have to work with on different things for a really long time. Maybe we move from remediation to supporting what they're doing in school, but we're still kind of working through what they need. So it really just depends.
Well,
Yeah.
I'll
Oh,
jump in here and
oh,
I'll jump in here and just tell you that my child at a certain point fired her tutor.
Yeah.
And so, sometimes the kid might do it for themselves where they sort of, she got to a point, she was a late acquisition reader and had some, support around developing those skills. And at a certain point, she looked at her tutor and said, I don't think I need you anymore. Which I thought was, it illustrates exactly what you're saying, the ability, the confidence that was developed. Jon, tell us about what success looks like. It may seem more obvious in the test prep realm that, a certain score equals success, but I think it's much more nuanced than that. So what does success look like in test prep with older kids who are, taking that ISEE, SSAT, or prepping for the college exams?
sure. And you definitely can measure success with test prep with things other than just what did they get on test day. There's actually a lot more to it than that. And one way I measure success is, does the student learn what they need to learn so well that they could tutor it back to me? I find that when they're at the point where they can just very eloquently, very clearly, say to me without saying anything to them, like, step by step what to do, just in terms of, confidence building, just in terms of them, remembering what they've learned even beyond taking the actual test. I find that like that's really, the threshold that, that you want to meet. And then something I also tell families is, when people come to me, they have a certain bottom line in a sense, they're trying to get into a certain school. And, in some cases you have to have a certain score. In the case of the SHSAT, whether or not you get into a specialized high school is completely contingent on what your score was. And, if you want to get accepted to an Ivy League school, you're in most circumstances going to need a top score. But as I remind parents, a standardized test is not just about knowing a bag of tricks. It's not like I just like show up to your home with my bag, with my tricks. I show, your child the tricks. And then, after a short period of time, we're done. There is a lot of overlap in terms of standardized tests and what students learn in school that I really emphasize that it's part of their child's education. That on a standardized test, with IC, SSAT, there's a lot of vocabulary. Young kids, especially if they haven't read much, really need to work on their vocabulary. These tests have to do with reading comprehension, which obviously is applicable to life in general. There's math. People who are strong math students, just out in the real world are just crisper, more logical thinkers. I think we use math even without realizing it. So a standardized test, getting ready for it, is part of your child's education. And a lot of times, when I'm preparing a student, there'll be material on the test that, they learned the previous year in school, or even 2 years, maybe even 3 years ago in school. I mean, it's not uncommon for me to be working with a junior in high school for the ACT or the SAT, and we'll be working on things that they learned in 8th grade and then forgot. So one of the things I love most about helping kids with standardized tests is that I can take what they've learned, either, up until meeting me, and like really, really like cementing, what they've learned over numerous years in school. And it's great because I think a lot of people who leave high school, even people who get into a top college, don't really retain, quite frankly, much of what they learned. So through the test prep process, knowing really making sure the content for the test, really, it can really just cement your education in general. And as far as I very explicitly, explain to students when they can take what they're learning and apply it to other contexts. So for example, with, standardized tests that have grammar on them, I really encourage the students, take ththese grammatical rules that we've learned in terms of punctuation and other things, apply them to your essays in school, just apply them to your writing in general. If, we're working on math to whatever extent possible, I'll just say like, here's a context where this is going to come up. So as far as when the process is done, I mean, tends to be more just kind of, a kind of clear end date because, once the family has the score that they want, there tends to be, being done. But, sometimes I will work with students academically, even after I've helped them with test prep. So like, for example, last year I had a student who, he did really, really well on the ACT. And then I helped him in his English class. And, I made sure that he remembered to use all the things that he learned for the ACT English section. So with a lot of students, there's kind of a hard stop day, but it can go on, somewhat beyond that.
You're muted.
Thank you. Let's get into a little bit of the nitty gritty, because I'm sure the audience wants to know, okay, I've met these 5 great people who have these incredible skills, and I now know what to look for in a tutor, and, to think about fit, and to think about goal setting, and to think about all the elements of what it is that I want for my child. But what is it going to cost me? That is always, that's like the real deal, right? People have to figure out, can they afford this? So the question I have is, where can families find an effective tutor, and what is it going to cost?
Okay. So I'll chime in and I'll address the first one first, where to find an effective tutor. I think someone said this earlier, but I always recommend that families reach out directly to their school first. If there is a learning services department or an individual learning specialist with whom you have a relationship, ask if they have any referrals for you, especially referrals that maybe other families have used and have had success with. If for any reason your school doesn't have suggestions, another great resource could be another school. For example, if you have a student at a mainstream school that is experiencing challenges with reading, reach out to a specialized school in New York City, like Stephen Gaynor School, like Windward, and see if they have any recommendations for you. Another place that you could look are some professional associations. So Kate mentioned Orton Gillingham. Again, if your student is having difficulty with reading, reaching out to something like the Orton Gillingham, the Academy of Orton Gillingham. If you're looking for test prep, the National Test Prep Association, these might be places, although schools I think are the best place to start. And then lastly, of course, checking out the Tutoring League website. I really do believe we have a group of highly effective, incredible educators. So that's a great place to look as well. In terms of cost, truly there is not like a broad strokes way to answer this, because you name it and you will find it in New York City, right? I mean, growing up in New York City myself, I knew students who were meeting with tutors that cost upwards of $1,000 a session, which they better be like cooking and doing the laundry too, but that's a separate conversation. But truly, if you find a tutor for $50 an hour, you can find a tutor for $1,200 an hour. But I would say from my experience, and especially among the professionals at the Tutoring League, the vast majority of rates fall somewhere between $200 up to $400 a session, which might be 45 minutes, might be 60 minutes. And again, when we're talking about tutoring, we're not talking about a college student sitting next to your student doing homework. We're talking about a professional who has expertise, who has experience, who has a higher degree and education. But that is typically, from what we've seen, is usually where the rate falls. It's a big financial commitment. It's a big financial commitment. But really, I guess I hope to emphasize that you're committing to a relationship. You're committing to something that will hopefully affect meaningful change for your child. But yeah, that's what I would say about that. And I would welcome anyone else's thoughts.
Oh, just one thing I would add about that, just in terms of, test prep process where, students are studying for the same test. It's not like you have a student who has one math teacher in school and then, a friend who has a different math teacher. Since students are studying for the same test, in some circumstances, what can be helpful on a number of fronts is if 2 students, work together during a lesson. And just my own experience, I'm very careful about that, because it only makes sense, if the students really need to work on the same things and they learn at, a similar pace. But, for families who, are really just trying to make this work, by having 2 or even 3 potentially students, working with a test prep tutor at the same time, and then each family pays a lower rate, that can be, a very, very helpful way to make sure that, the students get what they need in terms of meeting their goals, but also, at the same time, it makes it, financially manageable for the families.
And some tutors do offer sliding scales. Some even will offer completely pro bono work. It really depends on the tutor and what they're able to offer. But yeah.
And actually, towards that end, I will say some schools have relationships with tutors where the school will match the percentage financial aid that the family receives from the school or tutoring as well. So if a family's on 50% financial aid, the school will pay 50% of the tutoring fee. So that can also be available.
Thank you. I know it's always hard to talk about rates. It's a tricky wicket, as they say, but it's an important one, I think, to our audience. We did have a question about sort of tutoring in more than one subject, or tutoring, having more than one tutor during the week. What does that look like, for a student? I imagine this is probably a slightly older student, upper elementary or and beyond. But would you recommend that a child work with a tutor, two different tutors in the same week, say for science and English? Any thoughts on that?
I think, yeah, go ahead. Go back. Go.
Sure. So I think that, of course, it's important what the tutoring is for. I think that the vast majority of us would agree that the goal of a tutor, particularly for supporting a student who's struggling with material in their class, is to alleviate the amount of time and energy that student is using towards that, to free them up to do other things like learn to play the guitar and go to the park and all of those very important developmentally appropriate parts of childhood and adolescence. And so when you are a parent and you are deciding where to put your time and energy and your child's time and energy, I think it's a really helpful way to frame it, which is when, if they're seeing 3 tutors a week, they're not doing these things. So how can I prioritize the most important educational and academic support? And for some kids, that may look like really focusing on reading and waiting off on science or history or something like that until they're able to kind of lower the burden they're putting on reading and up it in other areas. And for, I think also in the enrichment space, I think parents often have this kind of idea that more is better. And I think it takes a tutor worth their weight, as Jane gave us today, to let those families know that more is not always better. It is taking up precious time that your child is not able to spend doing other equally important things, and you're the manager of your child's capacity. And so we would hope that you would really manage it in a way that would support their ability to explore a wide variety of areas. But Jane, did you have something else to say maybe?
No, but someone just asked a really great question.
It's a really good one. I would agree, Jane. Is there a state licensing or governing entity for tutors like there are for psychologists and physicians and other sort of health and wellness professionals?
Yeah.
So take it away, team.
There's not. And it's like a phenomenal idea that in a sense there should be. I mean, certainly any tutor who's gone through a higher ed program has gone through, some kind of vetting in that sense. And I think that's what makes this really tricky. I have a lot of dogs in my life, and I think of like dog trainers. It's sort of like the same thing. Like anyone can sort of print out a business card and call themselves a tutor or a trainer or something like that. And I think that's where vetting really plays a huge role. And so how do we vet? Like I said, going to your schools first, asking them for, tried and true recommendations. And then also like really getting granular in terms of what your child needs what you need to look for and the questions you need to ask. I talk a lot about reading and writing because that's my specialty. If your student is struggling with reading, find out what they're struggling with specifically. So you can ask a prospective tutor about those elements. Find out from your school the kind of tutor that he or she or they need. Is it someone who is trained and certified in this approach we've talked about a number of times in Orton Gillingham? And if it is, we need to make sure that that tutor is certified in Orton Gillingham. Speaking to references, to families who have used this tutor. Vetting is so, so important. And I'll pause there, but great question.
And I'm just going to jump in and say, you know, some of the rate conversation is directly related to, you kind of alluded to this earlier, Jane, right? To the credentialing, if you will. There may not be state licensing, but the reality is that really good tutors tend to be folks who have gone to ed school or are subject specific training. And that's very different than, say, a grad student who is getting that training, but has not yet become, you know, state or otherwise licensed or certified, right, through a graduate program and completed their training. And they may be sort of moonlighting on the side. They may have a lot to offer, but they don't have, say, a graduate degree from an ed school plus 10 years of working in a classroom with, you know, hundreds of students. That kind of experience, credentials, training, specialty equates to why, you know, folks might be paying what they're paying for a tutor.
I think just one response to that, as we know all too well in life too, is like credentials are important. They aren't everything, right? We've all been to a doctor who's graduated from the best schools who just didn't work for us. And so I think that's where really talking to references, families, and your schools, it really comes into play.
They need to be in a smaller group. We have another staffing relative to your set of tutors. So Jane, I think this is tell us about the Tutoring League and the 60 people in your consortium, 60 and growing, I suspect.
So yeah, just a point of clarification, Tutoring League is not a tutoring company. So no one is like staffed as part of Tutoring League. We are a community of education professionals. So I can't speak to staffing. I don't run a tutoring company, and no one here really does who's part of this panel. So I don't have much to offer on that front.
And there is, that's a really good question and delineation. There are individuals who work for themselves and work with individual families. And then there are sort of companies, right, who then staff tutors. And we're not going to get into the discrete differences in that today because we don't have time. But there are differences about whether or not you want to go with a kind of more corporate entity versus a more individualized recommendations. We had a question about sharing favorite educational websites. So if each of you wants to throw out a website that you think is, you know, of value, you know, for the population that you teach, I think we'd love to hear it.
So I'll say for math, because it's very specific, high school math, Desmos is amazing for graphing. So desmos.com, you can graph any function. wolframalpha.com is super helpful. You can check your work on like a lot of straightforward computational problems, and it's actually very good for students to do that. It's not cheating. You know, if you see that you have the incorrect answer, that's a great way to like, you know, check to yourself, okay, I better see where something went wrong here. And GeoGebra is another good one for math. Yeah, I'll put that in the chat.
She's going to put it in the chat. Yeah, she's doing it now. One website that I love that I'm putting in here now is the New York Times has a feature called What's Going On in This Picture. I love to use it with my students, and I think it could be a lot of fun for families to use as well. They post a picture from somewhere around the world where it's not clear exactly what's happening. And students have to use their critical thinking skills, their inferencing skills to try to understand what could be happening in this picture. Where geographically could this be taking place? What event might be occurring? And then every week they sort of they ultimately post the answer. I use this a lot with my students. And again, I think this could be a nice, like, dinner conversation or something like that. Yeah, I highly recommend it.
Beck, it's a little different in early childhood. You may not want them on a computer.
It is. It is. I actually think in early childhood, they all want them on the computer, but only for things that are educational. And so I think that depending on who is using it in terms of for a grown-up learning about how to best support their child, particularly in literacy, I really like the Literacy Nest. You can also go to OG Academy, Orton Gillingham Academy, which is the reading methodology that a lot of us have been talking about. And if you're looking for like app-based games, I think there's a million programs, but ABC Mouse is kind of like a tried and true, fun and easy one if that floats your boat. Yeah.
And Jon, any favorite websites in the test prep realm?
In the test prep realm, more what I have in mind in terms of just educational resources. What the New York Times has, I find it's been great. I know they have this one article called 1,000 essay topics that your kids can use. And I find like almost all of them are really engaging. So, at times when, I've helped students with their essay writing, including for when it's a standardized test, it's just a great resource just in terms of getting them to think of, things to write about and just getting them interested in writing, because all of those 1,000 topics are related to a young person's life.
Well, fantastic. I always love these conversations because they take us in places we didn't know we were going to go. And so I really want to thank the folks at the Tutoring League for being here today and for offering up their favorite educational websites. We may have to do a whole article on educational websites for the newsletter. That could be really a next fun thing to do.